Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I stumbled upon this channel showing up in my recommended videos, and it's actually this video is from a year ago, and it looks like it's an oversimplified style video telling the story of the German Revolution, which not a lot of people talk about. Happened at the end of the First World War and kind of is a big reason why Germany goes in the direction that it does. So this channel is called Things I Care About, and this is going to be the German Revolution Part 1. Definitely heavily inspired by Oversimplified from everything I'm reading in the comment sections. I haven't watched the video yet, so we'll take a look, and it looks like there is a Part 2, so we'll tackle that tomorrow. As always, the link is in the description. If you want to check out the original content creator, I would encourage you to do that. If you like what you see, give him some support so that they'll continue to make videos. I want to thank Michael in Middleburg, Virginia, so much. Thank you for your support on Patreon. Big supporter, and I really appreciate it. Could not do this without you. Thanks so much. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
You've heard of the French Revolution. You've heard about the Russian Revolution. But have you heard about the German Revolution? Filled with intrigue, treachery, and coup after coup after coup, where dreams of a socialist utopia turned into a fascist dystopia. Welcome to the craziest revolution of them all.
He acknowledges right up front, inspired by Oversimplified. The art definitely looks like that, as do the fonts there and the wording there. So yeah, one of the things we don't talk enough about, well, first of all, we don't talk enough about World War I. Hopefully this new History Channel series that's coming out with yours truly as a little part of it will help inspire more people to be interested in World War I. If not, hopefully my channel can do that and some other great content creators out there. But in the aftermath of World War I, the whole world changed. And a lot of these places that changed significantly continue to see fighting. There's fighting in Russia. People don't realize the United States had troops in Russia in 1919 after the war. So did other countries. There's fighting in Turkey that's going on. There's fighting in a lot of different places, and new countries are being formed. And the countries, even on the victorious side, like France and others, are having a fight for the soul of their nation and what direction they're going to go. There's strong push from socialists and communists, and there's democratic movements in places where democracy didn't exist before. Germany is just one of those places.
In 1914, a certain Austro-Hungarian Archduke wanted to see if it was possible for him to go for a drive around Sarajevo and not get assassinated. It was not, and the world was flung into World War I. In Germany, political parties overwhelmingly supported the war. Even the Socialist Party, who were supposed to be anti-war, supported it, because they viewed the Russian Empire as the biggest anti-socialist power in Europe. The war was supposed to be over by Christmas, but it dragged on, and by 1916 there was still no end in sight. In the front lines, hundreds of thousands of Germans had already fallen, while back home, the economy crumbled. There had been no preparations done for a long-time war.
Yeah, Germany never expected to be able to win a long-term war, though they nearly did. And I don't think we talk enough about Germany's prospects for still winning that war, even as late as early 1918. I think if the timing goes a little bit differently when it comes to how Russia exits the war, I say if Russia officially exits the war 6 months earlier, or the United States comes in 6 months later, I think there's a good chance Germany can at least negotiate kind of a white peace rather than a humiliating surrender, which is what ends up happening.
Skilled workers and farmers had been sent to the front, and all matters, political, military, and economic, fell upon the army generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff.
Yeah, this is important to note. By the time you get to 1918, the Kaiser is still nominally in charge of the country. I mean, at least at name only, but by and large, Hindenburg and Ludendorff are the ones who are running the show. It's a military dictatorship.
Were determined to achieve victory at any cost and subjugated civilian life to the needs of the war efforts. What this meant for workers was 12-hour workdays at minimal wages and insufficient food. It cannot be overstated how much of an impact the war had in the German population. Just in 1916, 250,000 Germans died due to starvation or disease related to lack of food.
And this doesn't get talked about enough. I've defended this before, and I'll say it again. Under the circumstances, I think Germany was entirely justified in operating unrestricted submarine warfare as a response to the Allied blockade. There was really, in my mind, no difference between what Germans were doing with U-boats and what the Allies were doing with their blockade. You see there the result of that, and that starvation is due in large part to the blockade of German ports. And the biggest reason for Germany losing the war is that blockade. Now, am I arguing that the Allies weren't also justified in blockading? No, I think that's part of warfare, and I think that they used a strength they had, which was the British Navy in particular, to blockade the ports, and that's what you do in war. But I understand Germany's response to it.
In these dire conditions, a group of socialists led by a woman called Rosa Luxemburg openly defied the continuation of the war and founded the Spartacus League. As the war
He has an image from the TV show Spartacus. That's great.
continued, more and more people joined the Spartakists. Why should we support the war? It is clearly an imperialist war driven entirely by capitalist control of the world market for the political domination of huge territories and to give scope to industrial and banking capital. My brother in Christ, I just asked for the time.
My brother in Christ, I asked for the time. That's good. I like that. Yeah, socialists were already a movement in Europe at this point. In Germany. I mean, Karl Marx was German, and he's kind of one of the godfathers of this movement, at least in terms of intellectually speaking. And so it makes sense that anytime you're dealing with a country that is going through the upheaval of a war like this. And it's not just Germany. Socialists are making a big push in France at this time. Obviously, they're doing that in Russia. There's differing degrees of success, but they're absolutely at work in every country in Europe.
And to be fair, they were right about the economic interest that caused the war, and people across Germany were beginning to see it. The movement continued to grow and spread across factories in Germany, with workers going on continuous strikes, until in June 1916, the emperor had two of the most important anti-war socialist leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, sentenced to prison. However, it was too little, too late. Hungry, tired and angry workers were beginning to identify more and more with socialist ideals.
When people are desperate, they'll turn to people they might not otherwise have turned to. Some of these people might not have been socialists in their heart, but when they're desperate, they're hungry, they're starving, their sons are dying in a war that they don't really increasingly understand why they're even involved in, because it really wasn't Germany's fight to begin with. It was Austria-Hungary and Serbia. These people are going to make a lot of sense to them.
And started to demand change. The emperor tried to appease the population by promising democratic elections in Prussia after the war ended. The Socialist Party became divided. Some wanted to continue the war and find reforms afterwards through elections. Others wanted an immediate end to the war, to the monarchy, and even demanded the proclamation of a socialist republic.
And remember, Germany's a fairly new country. It's only in its 40s at this point. Germany is still made up of constituent states that some of which are kingdoms, and so you have kings within Germany that are under the emperor. Emperor is also king of Prussia, which is the largest state that makes up the German Empire.
The SPD split. The first group turned into the majority SPD and the second to the independent SPD.
So that's actually really interesting, because you have the split between these socialists, one being the majority, and that's kind of what happens in Russia as well, where you have the Bolsheviks, which that word just basically means the majority group. And the same thing happens. It ends up being a split between what direction you want to go. And this happens a lot when there's a movement. When people are united against a common enemy, in this case, I mean within their own country. So, I mean, they're united in the belief that there need to be reforms and elections and everything. And but they're not united on how to get there. Sometimes you'll stay united until you overthrow the government, but then once you do, now you're fighting amongst yourselves to decide what direction you go afterwards.
Who joined forces with the Spartakists. The war took a turn for the better on March 3, 1918, when Russia officially surrendered, and a wave of patriotism swept through Germany as the Supreme Command could now move part of the Eastern armies to the Western Front.
And here's that situation of the timing being everything. If Russia leaves the war sooner, those 50 or so divisions that the Germans rushed to the Western Front get there sooner. Different story. French are dealing with mutinies in their army. The Americans in 1917 haven't arrived in any big numbers yet on the Western Front. But by March of 1918, that's changing. The Americans are showing up in big numbers. Things have stabilized on the Western Front. They've now got a Supreme Allied commander in Ferdinand Foch who's going to kind of oversee everything. And so the Germans launched this last-ditch attempt in this Kaiserschlacht, or spring offensive, to try and divide the British and the French, drive the British out of the war, bring the French to the negotiating table before the Americans can arrive in big enough numbers to turn the tide.
Many Germans truly believed that victory in the West was now at hand. Here you must keep in mind that news were highly manipulated. Newspapers reported only of victories, and defeats, if reported at all, were described as tactical maneuvers, so the average German had a distorted sense of the state of the war.
And I think that's true in all countries to a degree, but since we're talking about Germany, it makes sense to mention it here.
But reality was catching up. In September, the Balkan Front collapsed, and the Kingdom of Bulgaria, ally of Germany, capitulated. Austria-Hungary collapsed a few days later. Germany too was on the brink of defeat. During the Allied 100-day offensive between August and November 1918, they suffered defeat after defeat after defeat.
Yeah, so the 100 Days Offensive, specifically if you're going to be watching The Great War, which is the 4-hour series I'm a part of on History Channel coming out Memorial Day here in a couple of weeks. It's going to be focused very heavily on that 100 Days Offensive because that's the big offensive the U.S. is a part of. For the U.S. part, it's called the Meuse-Argonne Offensive because it takes place between the Meuse River in the east and the Argonne forest in the west, and we're actually right here in this kind of center area, and we're actually pushing south to north against the German lines there. And so the Germans are falling back on all fronts. By the end of September, Ludendorff and Hindenburg understand the war is not winnable anymore, and this is when they start pushing the civilian government to negotiate a peace before things completely collapse.
Fearing the inevitable, Generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg sent a representative to negotiate an armistice. American President Woodrow Wilson demanded as a precondition for surrender negotiations the retreat of Germany from all occupied territories, the cessation of submarine activities, and implicitly the emperor's abdication. With this demand, he intended to render the process of democratization irreversible.
So Wilson's big motivation in all of this is that he wants this to be about more than just winning the war. He's thinking about how do we reshape the world after the war. So that's why he wants things like the League of Nations, which is a precursor to the United Nations, which the United States will never even end up joining. But he also wants this idea of self-determination, that these countries within these empires can decide for themselves democratically who their leaders are going to be. Well, never mind the fact that one of the big allies for the United States in this war is the British, who have a constitutional monarchy. Now, granted, it's still a democratically elected government, and so that's not really a concern at this point. But that doesn't mean that the now House of Windsor, who have changed their name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which was too German, aren't a little bit concerned about where Wilson's going with all of this.
On September 29th, the Supreme Army Command informed the Emperor Wilhelm II that the military situation was hopeless.
Yep.
Give it to me straight, Ludendorff. How bad is it? I'm not gonna lie, it is very, very bad. I don't think we can hold the front for another 24 hours. We should request an immediate ceasefire.
And why does this matter? Because in the aftermath of the war, the spin is going to be the stab in the back theory, the idea that the military situation was in hand. It was the civilian leadership that betrayed us. But that's ridiculous. And even Ludendorff is going to be one of the people kind of saying that. Well, they understood in September that the military situation was untenable. They acknowledged that, and they pushed for this.
No way. The American president said he would only grant one if I abdicate. And you should.
Yeah.
What? Whose side are you on? Mein Kaiser, if you abdicate, we can blame the defeat on the socialists for protesting. Then, once the armies are back in Germany, we will use them to retake power. This was the birth of the stab in the back legend.
There it is.
The false belief that revolutionaries had undermined, sabotaged, and attacked the undefeated German army from the rear, turning an almost certain victory into defeat. However, 8 out
And specifically, who are you going to blame for this? The Bolsheviks and the Jews.
of the 10 socialist leaders just happened to be Jewish.
There you
And
go.
quickly, the conspiracy theory went from targeting socialists to including Jews as responsible for the German defeat.
And those two groups are the enemy in post-war Germany. They're the ones to blame for all of this.
With 2.7 million dead, there were few families untouched in Germany, and people were bitter.
Yep.
In October 1918,
And when you're bitter, you want somebody to blame.
over 1 million workers striked throughout Germany. Tired of the old regime, they formed councils or Räte after the Russian Soviets, seeking to establish their own socialist republic. But the leader of the MSPD, Friedrich Ebert, looking to weaken the influence of the Soviets, negotiated an early termination of the strike. The emperor abdicated, and Ebert considered the continuation of the revolution to be unnecessary.
Imagine a world where the socialists come out on top in Germany and you end up with an allied Germany and Soviet Union in the post-war world. Different world.
On October 24th, General Ludendorff changed his mind and declared the conditions of the Allies to be unacceptable. He now demanded the resumption of the war that he had declared lost only 1 month earlier. However, he did not have the support he expected and fled to Sweden with false papers. But while most Germans prepared for peace, the Imperial Naval Command in Kiel planned to dispatch the Imperial fleet for a last battle against the Royal Navy.
So before World War I, there's kind of this naval arms race, primarily between the German Empire and the United Kingdom. Germany can't possibly keep up, but they're trying to. And so they build this massive navy that they really only take out one time in any significant way, and that results in the Battle of Jutland. And even though there were some significant losses inflicted on the British Navy, Germany's like, we can't risk it anymore, and so they kind of parked the fleet after that. Well, now they give these orders to basically do like a kamikaze run as the German Navy, and the Navy's like, nope, not doing it.
The British think we are about to surrender, so this is the perfect time to attack. Any questions? Did the High Command authorize the attack? Not quite, but Admiral, the new government is engaged in peace negotiations. Wouldn't an attack undermine them? Okay, no more questions, just raise the anchor, we're moving.
Nope. Pretty much.
Well, that's just rude. Sailors on board 3 ships refused to weigh anchors. Some committed outright mutiny and sabotage. They were arrested without resistance and imprisoned in Kiel.
And some of this had happened, like I said earlier, I mentioned, with the French, there were mutinies in the French army. Imagine if all of the soldiers on all sides had just decided, you know what, we're not doing this anymore. I mean, I know on a limited basis some did, but who knows what happened.
Still, they achieved their goal. The Naval Command had to drop its plans for a naval engagement. On November 1st, hundreds of sailors joined forces with the socialists to demand an immediate release of
And
their
we've got
prisoners.
Spartacus there in the middle.
Raising slogans of peace and bread, they also demanded the end of the war and the improvement of food provisions. More and more people joined the protesters as they moved toward the military prison. Sub-Lieutenant Steinhäuser ordered his patrol to fire warning shots and then to shoot directly into the demonstration. 7 people were killed and 29 severely injured. Some demonstrators returned fire and the mass protest turned into a general revolt. The governor of the naval station was compelled to negotiate the release of the prisoners. By the evening of November 4th, Kiel was firmly in the rebels' hand.
And keep in mind the timeline here. This is November 4th. The war's not over yet while this is going on. This is all going on behind the scenes. And negotiations are about to start for the armistice. Kaiser's going to abdicate in a couple of days. He's actually going to abdicate while the negotiations are going on in Compiègne in France.
Delegations of sailors dispersed to all the major cities in Germany. By November 7th, the revolution had seized all large coastal cities as well as Hanover, Brunswick, Frankfurt am Main and Munich. Workers and soldiers formed councils, and by the end of the month, all 22 German monarchs had been dethroned.
22 German monarchs. So look at that. You've got the King of Prussia, who's Kaiser Wilhelm, King Ludwig of Bavaria, King Frederick Augustus of Saxony, King Wilhelm of Saxony. You've got a king of Württemberg. Then you've got Grand Dukes, and you've got dukes and princes. It's crazy.
But apart from the dynastic families, the councils deprived only the military command of their power and privilege. They did not interfere with the duties of police, municipal administrations, and courts. There were hardly any confiscation of property or occupation of factories, because such measures were expected from a new government. Hoping to gain over the middle-class parties and old elites of the German Empire, and fearing a radicalization of the revolution that could lead to a civil war, Ebert, the leader of the majority Socialist Party, met with the leaders of the old regime. They reached an agreement, and Ebert was made chancellor. Karl Liebknecht, recently released from prison, returned to Berlin and planned to proclaim Germany a socialist republic. SPD deputy chairman Philipp Scheidemann heard about this and immediately stepped out a balcony of the Reichstag and proclaimed Germany a democratic republic in front of demonstrators. This upset Ebert.
So there's like this race to who's going to declare what government first. Meanwhile, the Kaiser is still out there,
who wished to leave their choice of political system to a national assembly. Just hours later, Liebknecht proclaimed that Germany was now a socialist republic and called for elections to form the Council of People's Deputies, who on November 11th signed the armistice that officially ended World War I.
And a few years later, the main civilian authority who negotiated that armistice that was signed on November 11th is going to be assassinated as part of the reprisals over the stab in the back myth in all of this. At this point, the Kaiser, you see he flees to Holland. He'll spend the rest of his life in and around Doorn in the Netherlands, where he dies during World War II.
The new government passed the 8-hour workday and severely strengthened worker unions. They expanded social insurance, unemployment benefits, and worker compensations, while working on a series of projects to improve health insurance and housing availability. In the meantime, the Supreme Command was raising its own paramilitary force, the Freikorps, paramilitary organizations that would operate inside Germany. Many of its members were former soldiers who struggled to readjust to civilian life. They were very nationalistic and ferociously anti-socialist. In December, all of Germany's councils were to meet in Berlin to vote on whether to make Germany a council or Soviet republic. Ebert and his government ordered the army to move into Berlin to prevent the convention, but while attempting to arrest the council leaders, the soldiers opened fire on unarmed demonstrators who were supporting the convention, killing 16 people. Despite the massacre, Ebert's plan to prevent the convention failed. But it was also unnecessary. The convention voted overwhelmingly against the creation of a council system and instead supported Ebert's call for elections to choose a constituent national assembly that would decide upon the state system.
So you've got the more reasonable outcome here, the less extreme. People want to be able to vote on this rather than just declare the new government.
During the revolution, an elite regiment, the Revolutionary Guard, had been stationed in Berlin to protect the government. But Ebert now feared that they were getting too friendly with the Spartakists. So on December 23rd, he dismissed them from Berlin and ordered to reduce their members. To force them to comply, the city commander Otto Wels held their pay. The Revolutionary Army seized the Reichschancellery and arrested several members of the government until their salaries were paid. Chancellor Ebert called upon the army to force them out, attacking them in the skirmish of the Berlin Schloss. However, many of
Schloss is like a word for castle. Or like a fortification.
Ebert's soldiers defected, and the Berlin police...
I love the dude eating like strawberry ice cream at the top. Yeah, again, this is what I'm talking about. I mean, we think November 11th, 1918, World War I ended. That was the end to the fighting and the dying in Europe, and it wasn't in many places, including Germany.
Led by Emil Eichhorn, refused to act against the revolutionaries. With over 30 dead and 50 wounded, the battle was a clear defeat for Ebert's government, who was forced to pay the sailors and postpone their size reduction. However, the confrontation was a turning point for the Spartakists. Tired of the SPD, they left the party and formed the German Communist Party, KPD. On January 4th, 1919, Ebert dismissed police chief Eichhorn for failing to act against the revolutionaries and demonstrating workers. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets the very next day, many of them armed. The demonstrators occupied train stations and several newspapers that the previous day had called not only for the raising of more Freikorps, but for the murder of the Spartakists. On January 8th, Ebert decided to use troops stationed in Berlin against the occupiers. They violently quelled an improvised revolt on January 9th, and just a few days later, the Freikorps moved into Berlin. They brutally cleared several buildings and executed the occupiers on the spot.
So you can kind of get a sense here that what happens in the decades to come with the National Socialist Party, and I say that understanding that they're not, they start out socialist. I don't want to get into a big debate about this. I'm only saying it to not get demonetized by saying the other word that we normally know them as. But by the time the 1930s roll around, they're not really National Socialists anymore, though they still have that title.
Freikorps murdered at least 100 workers,
Wow.
even those who surrendered. Just a few days later, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were arrested and delivered to a Freikorps division that beat them up and executed them. The perpetrators of the murders went mostly unpunished.
Jeez,
After coming to
I didn't know
power,
that.
the SPD government had not wiped out the Army's Supreme Command or the judiciary. And now, the judges, many longing for a return to the old order, gave right-wing criminals, assassins and terrorists a slap on the wrist for their crimes as long as the victims were either revolutionaries or associated with the new democratic German state.
Interesting.
The few people that went to prison for the murder of the Spartacus leaders were later compensated by the Nazi government, and later investigations showed that the murders of Karl and Rosa had been approved by Ebert himself.
Interesting. So, yeah, it's interesting how that stuff always comes out later on, eventually, in there. Kindly do a murder on Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg.
From this point on, the political differences between the SPD and the KPD became insurmountable, and in following years, they would be unable to work together to stop the rising threat from the Nazi Party.
And here you have the standard has been set that you get what you want through violence. And so that's why in the early 1920s, that's what the National Socialists are going to try to do, is to use violence and use force of arms to take over the government. When that fails, that's when they start to use the democratic process to get their way, while still simultaneously having kind of an armed wing to their party.
The first elections came shortly after. The SPD became the strongest party and joined with other center parties to form the Weimar Coalition. Ebert was elected president. The new Weimar Constitution offered more possibilities for a direct democracy by setting up a mechanism for referendums. It also had a simple rule. You gain 60,000 votes, you gain one seat in parliament. While this allowed for more representation, it also made it very difficult to build coalitions. In fact, no parties achieved a majority during the 1920s. There was another massive problem.
And that is a huge problem because if you're not familiar with a parliamentary system, when you've got multiple parties like that, if nobody's got a majority, that means they need to form a coalition with other parties to get that majority. And if you can't work together and play nice with other people, you can't get a majority. And so there's chaos. And the Nazis are going to use that. Oh, I just said it anyway. They're going to use that chaos to eventually take control of the government in the 1930s.
Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution granted the president the authority to rule against the majority in the Reichstag with the help of the army, if need be. Article 48 would become instrumental in destroying German democracy.
Yep.
In Bavaria, the USPD, who had political control over the state after the Bavarian king's resignation, suffered a crushing defeat in the elections. Eisner, the Bavarian USPD leader,
Let's go back and look at those election results. Bavarian People's Party and Social Democratic Party almost identical in terms of the percentage of the vote that they got.
a crushing defeat in the elections. Eisner, the Bavarian USPD leader, was assassinated by a right-wing terrorist just days later.
Yep.
Listen, I know this looks bad, but I swear it was him. Rumors blamed another socialist leader who was then shot twice by one of Eisner's supporters while inside the parliament. Fighting broke out, killing 2 other members. Because of the chaos, Bavaria no longer had an effective government. The new socialist leader, Johannes Hoffmann, organized a new coalition government, but was overthrown by a group of communists who proclaimed Bavaria to be a Soviet republic. But this government was then overthrown by another communist group, who were then overthrown by the return of Hoffmann and several thousand soldiers and Freikorps who...
Imagine being a part of all of this. You've just gone through one of the deadliest wars in history. And so you've also, while that war is going on, not only is pretty much every family unaffected in terms of losing someone, a husband, a son, a brother, a friend, but you've also had hundreds of thousands of civilians dying from starvation and disease, and your economy has been just destroyed. You've had these crippling reparations put on you afterwards by the victorious nations, and now you're facing this constant governmental upheaval. There's just no idea what's going on. This all really helps us to understand the conditions that made it possible for what happens next.
Brutally ended the Soviet Republic. 600 people were killed during the fighting, 300 of them civilians. After their victory, Freikorps executed at least 1,000 people suspect of being communist. Bavaria officially joined the Weimar Republic. The left was divided once more, and the chaos of the period made the state shift significantly to the right. In June,
it's a reaction. When you have what is viewed by many as a strong threat, there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction against it. People who otherwise might not have considered themselves far right might jerk to the far right because they oppose the actions of what's happening on the left. We see that all throughout history. We're seeing it right now. People have a knee-jerk reaction because they might violently or strongly oppose somebody on one side. It causes them to go much further to the opposite side, and you get a polarization.
1919, the government signed the Treaty of Versailles, officially ending World War I. The treaty made Germany renounce sovereignty over its colonies and lose a large portion of territory.
I love that a French guy with a baguette is doing all of this.
Germany would be occupied for 15 years by the Allies, and they were forced to pay massive reparations, the amount of which no one even knew how to estimate. They also had to accept all guilt for the war and its consequences. All of this was incredibly upsetting for Germans, who despised the treaty, and those who signed it. But there was another demand. The treaty required Germany to demilitarize significantly, and that meant that the Freikorps had to be disbanded. In February 1920, Defense Minister Noske ordered the disbandment of two of the most powerful Freikorps divisions that were stationed near Berlin. These Freikorps were extremely opposed to Eber's democratic government, and their commander Erhard refused the dissolution. He reached out to his allies Wolfgang Kapp, Generals Walter Lüttwitz, Erich Ludendorff, and even Waldemar Pabst, the man responsible for the murders of Liebknecht and Luxemburg. Erhard ordered his brigade to march into Berlin and ruthlessly break any resistance. They carried swastikas on their helmets and vehicles, and it was here that it would become a symbol for anti-government and anti-Jewish sentiment.
He's got the swastikas blurred out for obvious reasons. It's the unfortunate reality on YouTube that certain things you can't say, certain things you can't show unless you want your channel to be demonetized and age restricted.
The city's defenders refused to fire on the soldiers, claiming that Reichswehr doesn't fire on Reichswehr. The government fled the city. With support from the troops and higher echelons of society, Kapp declared himself Chancellor.
All right, so it looks like that's where we're going to wrap up this episode. So let me know what you think of all that. We will come back and do part 2 of that tomorrow. Those of you maybe in Germany or just who have a great interest in this part of history, add to the conversation. Let's all learn together. I'm learning a lot of things I didn't know about. I knew kind of the basics of what was happening, but not the details. So it's been pretty fascinating. I thought it was really well done. And I'm looking forward to part 2 tomorrow. So I want to thank Catherine in East Hampton, Massachusetts, and Sean in Raleigh, North Carolina. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. If you want to learn more about how to support the channel, you can click on the link down below for Patreon. Also check out the new channels, Stories of the Civil War, Stories of the Great War. All of my original content on those topics will be on those channels moving forward. Thanks for watching.